6 facts about a man with no friends. God removes people for a reason. Have you ever wondered why some men walk alone in life? Why friends vanish and connections fade? What if I told you? God removes people for a reason. Today, we're diving into 6 facts about a man with no friends and uncovering the biblical wisdom behind this divine separation. God's separation is often for protection. It can feel confusing and painful when people suddenly exit your life, especially if they were close to you. But from a biblical perspective, we see time and again that divine separation is not rejection, it's redirection. Proverbs 13:20 says, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." This verse teaches that your associations shape your future. If God sees that certain people are bringing harm, distraction, or spiritual danger to your walk with Him, He will remove them, even if you don't understand why at the time. Many men wonder why they find themselves alone, abandoned by people they once trusted. They interpret their isolation as failure, or a sign that something is wrong with them. But Scripture shows that God often removes people to shield you from consequences you can't foresee. Take Abraham, for example. God called him to leave his family and homeland. Why? Because God wanted to build a new nation through him. If Abraham had stayed in his familiar environment, influenced by old mindsets, he could never step into the destiny God prepared. The separation was necessary for protection, not just physical, but spiritual and generational. Consider Samson, a man chosen by God from birth. Despite his strength, he fell repeatedly because of poor relationships. His downfall wasn't from enemies alone, but from someone close. Delilah. God had set him apart, but Samson resisted that separation. He surrounded himself with people who didn't honor his calling, and it cost him everything. The lesson is clear: when God removes people, ignoring that can be dangerous. It's not about loneliness. It's about protection from pitfalls that come through wrong influences. Jesus himself lived this principle. Though he loved the crowds, he didn't entrust himself to them. He chose his inner circle carefully. And even within that group, he recognized betrayal. In John 6:6, many disciples walked away from Jesus because his teachings were hard to accept. He didn't chase them. Why? Because he knew not everyone was meant to go where he was going. Separation cleared the space for deeper purpose. In your life, God may remove friends, colleagues, or even family from close proximity. It can feel like abandonment, but it's often divine protection. Sometimes these people carry jealousy, distraction, gossip, or temptation. You might think they're harmless, but God sees the unseen. He knows the thoughts, motives, and spiritual condition of those around you. When He steps in to sever a relationship, it's because keeping it could harm your spiritual progress or derail your assignment. Men are often taught to be self-reliant, to push through challenges without reflecting on the spiritual side. But spiritual wisdom acknowledges that relationships are not random. They are strategic. And when God steps in, we must trust that His removal is surgical, not spiteful. Just as a good doctor removes infection to save the body, God removes toxic people to save your soul. It's not always because they're evil, but because their season in your life has ended. You may notice after a separation that your peace increases. Your clarity improves. Your prayer life deepens. That's a sign of divine intervention. God doesn't just take people out. He brings growth through it. Painful as it may be, it's purposeful. You're being positioned for something greater. Protection doesn't always look like a shield. Sometimes it looks like an empty room. That emptiness creates space for the right people, divine connections who will help, not hinder, your walk. When God removes people, don't fight it. Don't chase what He has cut off. Trust His wisdom. You may not understand it now, but later you'll see the blessing. In hindsight, you'll recognize the storms you avoided, the damage you were spared, and the peace you gained. God's protection is not always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet goodbye. But make no mistake, His separation is always intentional, always for your good, and always leading you closer to your purpose. Isolation precedes elevation. In the Bible, we see a consistent pattern where God isolates a man before He promotes him. This period of solitude is not punishment but preparation. Many men misunderstand this season of their lives, feeling rejected, overlooked, or forgotten. But in reality, God is setting the stage for something greater. He is removing distractions, teaching dependence, and building strength in hidden places. Before David ever sat on the throne of Israel, he was alone in the fields tending sheep. He was not invited to the table when Samuel came to anoint a king, yet was in that isolation that God shaped his character. David learned to fight lions and bears, to worship in silence, and to trust God without recognition. That private development prepared him for public leadership. The elevation did not begin in the palace, it began in obscurity. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness after fleeing Egypt. He had been raised in Pharaoh's court, trained in royalty, and educated in power. But when he tried to deliver God's people in his own strength, he failed. God sent him into isolation, not to punish him, but to break him of self-reliance and prepare him for divine assignment. In the desert, Moses learned humility, patience, and how to hear the voice of God. Only after that long season of separation did call him through the burning bush to lead Israel out of bondage. That shows us something important. Isolation is not wasted time. It is holy ground where God equips you for impact. Even Jesus embraced this pattern. Before launching his public ministry, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days. He fasted, prayed, and faced temptation. There were no crowds, no miracles, no applause, just silence and struggle. But that season solidified his identity and sharpened his focus. When he returned, he began preaching with authority and power. His elevation came after the wilderness, not before it. This tells us that before God sends you out, He first sets you apart. He develops what no one sees, so that what everyone sees will be strong, anointed, and unshakable. When a man finds himself with no friends, no invitations, and no platform, it can feel like failure. But in God's economy, this isolation is often the training ground for leadership. God uses the silence to fine-tune your ears to His voice. He uses the stillness to teach obedience without applause. He removes people to show you He is enough. That's a critical truth. Before you can lead others, you must learn to be led by God alone. Elevation without foundation is dangerous. That's why God takes time to build you in private before revealing you in public. This process is never easy. It challenges your pride, tests your endurance, and exposes your weaknesses. But it also builds spiritual muscles that fame and friends can't provide. You learn to pray because there's no one else to talk to. You learn to work with excellence even when no one is watching. You learn to stand firm in faith without external validation. These lessons become the pillars that support your future elevation. Sometimes we are tempted to rush out of isolation, to react to people or opportunities just to feel connected. But if you short-circuit the process, you also forfeit the power that comes with it. Think of Joseph, who was sold by his brothers, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Each step seemed like a setback, but it was actually preparation. In prison, he developed administrative skills, interpreted dreams, and learned to trust God completely. When Pharaoh called him, Joseph was ready. His isolation became the soil for his promotion. If you are in a season where you feel alone, misunderstood, or unseen, don't despise it. This is the place where God refines his servants. He is stripping away distractions, idols, and crutches so that you can rise with integrity and purpose. Elevation is not about status. It's about stewardship. And those who are elevated by God are always first trained by God in secret. Trust the process. The same God who allowed the isolation will orchestrate the elevation when the time is right. Your season of separation is the birthplace of your assignment. Spiritual growth often happens in solitude. Many people associate growth with community, church gatherings, or powerful sermons. And while those are important, some of the deepest spiritual breakthroughs happen when you are completely alone. Solitude strips away distractions and forces a man to confront his true self. Without the noise of people, opinions, and social obligations, what remains is the unfiltered presence of God and the reality of your own heart. This environment, though uncomfortable, is where transformation takes root. The Bible is filled with examples of men who grew closest to God not in crowds, but in isolation. Elijah fled to the wilderness, depressed and afraid, yet it was there that God spoke to him, not through earthquake or fire, but in a still small voice. That quiet voice could only be heard because everything else had been silenced. When a man has no friends, he is more likely to seek intimacy with God. He prays differently, not of routine, but out of desperation. The absence of people drives him to the presence of God. Psalm 2:516 says, "Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted." This plea reveals a deep spiritual truth. Loneliness can become a doorway to divine intimacy. In solitude, prayer becomes more authentic, more raw. Worship becomes less about performance and more about communion. There is no one to impress. No social mask to wear, only you and God in a sacred encounter. That level of vulnerability often leads to greater spiritual maturity. Jesus modeled this repeatedly. Despite the demands of his ministry and the constant presence of crowds, he frequently withdrew to solitary places to pray. Luke 5:16 tells us, But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. He did not avoid solitude, he sought it. Why? Because he understood that real strength from secret places. Solitude is where the soul is nourished, where direction is received, and where the heart is aligned with the will of the Father. If Jesus, the Son of God, needed solitude to stay spiritually sharp, how much more do we? Solitude also reveals what relationships can sometimes hide. In the company of others, a man may appear confident, faithful, and strong. But in solitude, the truth emerges. Fears, doubts, sins, and wounds rise to the surface. This is not to shame or condemn, but to heal. God uses solitude as a mirror. He shows you areas that need surrender, patterns that need breaking, and wounds that need his touch. This self-awareness is not possible in the business of constant interaction. Alone with God, there is space for repentance, reflection, and renewal. Spiritual growth also requires listening, and solitude makes room for that. In a world full of noise and opinions, it becomes difficult to hear God's voice. But when you are alone, your spiritual ears become more sensitive. God speaks through Scripture, through His Spirit, and through inner impressions that guide and comfort. I ask you something: the clarity you gain in solitude often shapes the decisions you make when you re-enter community. Many men try to find a direction through conversation with others, but the most important guidance often comes in quiet moments with God. Solitude allows you to hear what crowds drown out. Some men fear being alone, interpreting it as a sign of failure or rejection. But in God's eyes, solitude is not a setback. It's an invitation. It's a personal meeting between the Creator and His Son. It's a space where transformation happens, not just externally but internally. Spiritual growth is about becoming more like Christ, and that requires internal change, something solitude fosters more effectively than social activity ever could. You begin to hunger for righteousness, long for purity, and walk more closely with the Spirit. The fruit of this growth is evident. A man who has grown spiritually in solitude walks with quiet strength. He is less reactive, more discerning, more grounded in truth. He doesn't seek validation from others because he has already received affirmation from God. He serves from overflow, not obligation. He can lead others well because he has first been led by God in private. His roots are deep, and his faith is unshakable, because it was formed non-comfort but in consecration. If you find yourself alone, without friends or fellowship, see it as a season of growth. Use it to draw near to God, to examine your heart, and to listen to His voice. This solitude is not empty. It is fertile soil for spiritual maturity. Embrace it, for it is in these quiet places that God does His deepest work. Not everyone is meant to stay in your life. This is a truth that many men struggle to accept, especially when relationships end without explanation or when friends fade away during critical moments. It can feel personal, even painful, but from a spiritual perspective, it is often necessary. God, in His wisdom, allows people to come and go based on the role they are meant to play in your journey. Some are there to teach you, some to walk with you for a season, and some to push you closer to God through their departure. Holding on to people who were only meant to be temporary can delay your growth, confuse your purpose, and create unnecessary emotional weight. The Bible is full of examples where God allowed separation for a greater reason. One of the clearest is the story of Abraham and Lot. They journeyed together for a time, but eventually their possessions and herds became too large to manage side by side. Conflict arose between their herdsmen, and Abraham suggested they part ways. Lot chose the fertile land near Sodom, while Abraham remained in the land God had promised. It was only after Lot separated from Abraham that God reaffirmed His covenant and showed Abraham the full extent of the promised land. That moment teaches us that some revelations and blessings are delayed until certain people are no longer attached to us. Jesus also demonstrated this principle. Throughout His ministry, He attracted crowds, but He did not chase after those who left. In John 6:66, many of His disciples turned back and no longer followed Him because they could not accept His teachings. Jesus did not plead with them to stay. He even asked the 12, "Do you want to go away as well?" Indicating that He was not afraid of people walking away. He understood that not everyone could go where He was going, and not everyone would understand the calling placed on His life. In the same way, men today must recognize that divine calling often leads to separation. Some people simply cannot handle the next level of your journey, and God removes them to protect what He is building in you. Holding on to relationships that God is trying to remove can hinder progress. When you fight to keep people who are not aligned with your purpose, you end up carrying weight that slows you down. Hebrews 2:1 encourages us to lay aside every weight and sin that so easily entangles us so we can run with endurance the race set before us. Some people in your life are not sinful, but they are a weight. They distract you, discourage you, or draw you back into old habits. Letting go is not an act of bitterness, it is an act of obedience. It is trusting that God knows who belongs in your next chapter and who does not. Seasons change, and with them, relationships shift. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us that there is a season for everything, including a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Spiritual maturity involves recognizing those times and responding with grace and faith. Just because a relationship ends does not mean it was a mistake. It may have served its purpose. God often uses people to shape us, challenge us, and teach us lessons. When their role is fulfilled, He moves them aside so we can continue forward. This truth also protects us from placing our identity in human relationships. When people leave, it reminds us that our foundation must be Christ alone. If our value is rooted in friendships, followers, or approval, their absence will break us. But if we are anchored in God, we remain steady even when people walk away. Psalm 118:8 says, "It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man." People will come and go, but God remains constant. His plan is never dependent on who stays, it is fulfilled by who He is. Letting go requires trust. It requires faith that God sees what you do not. He knows the conversations you are not part of, the intentions hidden behind smiles, and the future challenges that certain relationships could bring. When He removes someone, it is never random. It is strategic. Your responsibility is not to chase what God is cutting off, but to align yourself with His will. Sometimes peace only comes after the separation. What looks like loss may actually be protection. What feels like rejection may be redirection. Not everyone is meant to stay in your life, and that is not a sign of failure. It is a mark of divine alignment.